Hello everyone, and welcome to the next lesson in our Snap course. This is lesson 2.3, controlling the stage. So we're going to be learning about the control blocks. Okay, so what can we use the control blocks to do? Well, we use them to start and stop code segments. Today we're also going to be mainly using them to send messages between objects like our sprites and our stages. And we'll also use them to, for example, repeat actions using loops or wait before actions. And we can also use them for if-else statements. So essentially what we might call conditionals. So if something happens, then do something. Or if it doesn't happen, else do something else. So let's actually dive deeper into this. So first of all, let's go into starting and stopping code. There are many ways to start and stop code. So the first one is the when flag click button. So this runs when that green flag in the upper right corner of the snap page is clicked. So if you click that green flag, anything that is attached to a green flag, when green flag click block, will start to run. Another block is the when a certain key pressed. So this block is essentially for running code when a certain key is pressed. So for example, if the user clicks the space key, then you might want to do something. Like in a game, you might want to jump if the user clicks the space key. So whenever the user clicks the space key, you might have some code that's attached to the when space key pressed, and that'll run. Next, there's the when I am clicked button or block, which allows you to do certain actions when something happens to the sprite. So when something happens to the sprite, you want to run a certain action. There's also this more generic block, which is just when and then a Boolean block. So if you remember that hexagon shaped block is for inputting Boolean values. So you can put some kind of Boolean, so either true or false, into that block, and it'll run if that Boolean is true. So for example, you might put the sensing block touching red. So when touching red, that would just be if the sprite is touching the color red, then it'll run the code. And actually, in Scratch, you can't actually set it to be a general range of colors like red. You have to choose a very specific color value. There's also when I receive. So this is when a certain message is received. So if another sprite sends some kind of message to this sprite and the sprite receives it, it'll run a certain piece of code. The last starting block is when I start as a clone. So this is for clones, which we'll talk about a lot later in the course. Okay, so what about stopping code? Well, first of all, there is the report code block. And this block essentially stops code. And it reports a value. So similar to a reporter block. So for example, report 5 would stop all the code at that point, and it would, or not all the code, but all the code in that chunk of code. And it would report a certain value, specifically 5. The next block is stop. So the stop block can be used to end a certain piece of a program. It can stop the entire program, so everything that's running. It can stop the current segment. It can stop any piece that you want to stop specifically. There's also the delete this clone block. This completely gets rid of a clone, which we'll talk about later. There are other ways to start and stop code. And so for example, you can use something like run, tell, launch, the other run block, and etc. And all these blocks can be used to start and stop code, or certain segments. So let's talk about sending messages. So you can send messages using this broadcast block. So these blocks can broadcast and receive certain messages. So a message is essentially some kind of signal. It's not a message in the way that we think of a message. For example, you might think of a message being consisting of a sequence of words or something like that. But these messages are different. They're almost like flares, or sending up some kind of signal so that other sprites can read the signal and execute a certain piece of code. So for example, you can broadcast the message hi, and when other sprites see that the message hi has been broadcasted, they can run a piece of code. So there are 3 blocks that are important with this. The broadcast block. This allows you to broadcast a certain message to everything. So imagine someone getting on a stage with a loudspeaker and broadcasting it to everyone. Everyone can hear the message, and based on the fact that they hear it, they can run something. This block is special because once you broadcast it, the sprite that broadcasted it doesn't wait for the signal to be received. It just continues the code that it already has. But there's another block, broadcast and wait, which waits for another object to receive the broadcast. And after the broadcast is received, it will continue with the further code. So finally, there's another way to send messages, which is send to. This block allows you to send messages to specific sprites. So rather than getting up on a stage and broadcasting it to everyone, you're going to specifically go to that sprite and whisper to that sprite. So only that sprite will be able to receive the message. Okay, so if you remember, we've talked about reporters. And we even looked at an example of the reporter answer. So what do you think that this reporter message in the upper right corner would do? You can take a moment to think about it, and you can pause the video if you need to. Alright, so assuming you've thought about it, the message reporter would essentially hold the last message that was broadcasted. So if you were to click on the message block or reporter, it would essentially tell you or report what the last message was. Okay, so let's look at an example of sending messages. So without the code, we might think of this. So we might want sprite 1 to say hi. So on the stage, you're going to see sprite 1, and you're going to see a little message saying hi that pops up. Then we want sprite 2 to say hello after that. So it'll almost look like a conversation. Sprite 1 says hi, then sprite 2 says hello. So to do this, to create this effect, we would use the segments on the right. So in sprite 1's area, this would be the segment. We have when the green flag is clicked, say hi for 2 seconds, then broadcast go and wait. So for sprite 2, when I receive go, so when sprite 2 receives go, sprite 2 would say hello for 2 seconds. So what does this look like? First, the user is going to click the flag. So the user clicks the flag, and then sprite 1 says hi. Then sprite 1 broadcasts the message go and waits. So you can imagine sprite 1 taking out its loudspeaker and broadcasting the message go. So now sprite 2 is going to listen and receive the message go. So go is sent from sprite 1 out to everyone, and sprite 2 will receive it. When sprite 2 receives go, sprite 2 is going to say hello for 2 seconds. So what this will look like is sprite 1 says hi, then sprite 2 says hello. And then sprite 1 and sprite 2 can continue their code. Okay, so let's talk about repeating and waiting now. So repeating is done with loops. So the loop blocks in Snap are forever, which repeats a segment of code forever until you use the end block to stop it. There's the repeat block, which repeats the input number of times. So you input the number of times you want something to repeat. There's the repeat until block, which repeats until the input is true. And there's the for block. And we'll discuss the for block in the future. But essentially the for block is running on a variable. So it'll run a certain number of times based on some variable I, which is essentially your counter or your index. There's a lot of names you can give it. Okay, so let's actually take another look at if-else statements. So this is known as a conditional. So if we have some code, we might want to do something like execute this segment if something happens or something along those lines. So we have some blocks for that. The first block is the if block. If the input is true, and again the input is a boolean, then the code inside the if block will run. There's also the if else block. So if the input is true, then the code inside the if part will run. It looks just like the if block. However, if the input is false, then the else part will run. There's also the reporter version of the above, which essentially does the same thing, except it takes it in the form of a reporter. So we can use the following chart on the right to understand what would happen in a flowchart. So we have some code, and then that diamond represents a boolean. So if that boolean is true, then a certain thing will happen. And if it's false, then another thing will happen. But regardless of what the outcome is, after that, the following sequence of code will run. So that's just how we represent an if-else statement with a flowchart. And those shapes are what you would use. For example, a diamond is what you use for a boolean or a conditional. And these squares are for segments of code or rectangles. Okay, so let's try this experiment. So in your program, you're going to have to try and code the following animation. Have sprite 1 say hi for 2 seconds. Then have sprite 2 say hello for 2 seconds. Then change the background of the stage. So change the stage. Then repeat this 1 to 3 times or 1 to 3 to 5 times using a loop. So as a hint, you need to send messages to control what happens when. And if you can tell, all the text is color-coded in terms of where the blocks come from. So for example, that purple text means that you might want to look in the looks section, and that orange text means you might want to look in the control section. So you can try this on your own, and you can see on the right what this final product would look like. First, the sprite says hi, then the other sprite says hello, then the stage changes. Then this first sprite says hi and hello, and the whole thing repeats again and again with different colors of the stage. Or you can make the stage anything you want. Okay, so let's practice by working on the animation project. Okay, so again, this is the animation project, just so that we can recap. You just have to make a short story, and we started this last class, and we're going to try to meet some new checkpoints. Okay, so the first checkpoint is that, similar to the experiment, you're going to have to make your sprites talk and change the stage repeatedly. This has to do with your animation. So whatever you want to do in your story, try to make some dialogue and try to make the setting or the stage change. So you should try to have at least 5 stages in total and use motion where it's possible to make the story more engaging and interesting. So those are your checkpoints, and you can essentially do what you want to do for the animation project at this point. So for example, if you wanted to make that lesson about the boy going to school and learning math or learning how to add, you could have some dialogue with the boy saying bye to his family and going on a bus to school, and then after they get to school, he learns how to add. And so you can start doing that. Last time, you should have already created a few sprites and a few stages, so you can use those now. Okay, so what's missing at this point? In fact, we're basically set to create the animation project. We have motion blocks, which we can use to move sprites. We can use look blocks to say things or change the sprite's appearance. We also have sound blocks for music. And we have control blocks for what code executes when. So using these different types of blocks, try your best to make a really cool animation project. And I know we didn't go over the sound blocks that much, but again, they're pretty self-explanatory, and so you should try using them and learning how to use them yourself. So next class, what we'll be doing is finishing up the animation project. So you have the rest of this time to work on the animation project, and you can work on it next class. Remember that it should tell a short story, and it doesn't have to be too complicated. Okay, so after completing the other checkpoints, you can continue working on the animation project, just making it better, and try to finalize it. So use as much of the things that we've learned to make whatever you think you want to make as close to it as possible. Okay, so also here's another challenge. So try using the for loop. Even though we haven't learned it, you can try figuring it out yourself. So basically, the for loop is, to use the for loop, you're gonna have to have a variable, and you're going to make something happen for each value of that variable. So I here is a variable, and that I block is a reporter that reports the value of I. So what you should do is, for example, use this for loop to do something with that variable I. Rather than using the repeat block, you can, where you can only do a limited set of things, this I variable lets you do things with the variable I. So for example, you could make a sprite count from 1 to 10. So a sprite for I equals 1 to 10, you could make the sprite say I. So go to the looks category, get the say block, and then drag that I reporter into the little white bubble. And if you do that, the sprite will count from 1 to 10. So try incorporating the for loop into your project. Okay, and that's all for today. So we hope you enjoyed that, and good luck on the animation project. We'll see you in the next lesson.